everyone, welcome to Just Crunch It. I'm your host Vikram, and we launched this podcast with the intent that everyone who cares about data should find something valuable out of it. This podcast is for you if you're starting up or rethinking how things will evolve with all the latest advancements in technology. This is for you if you use data in your day to day, or for that matter, are just thinking about getting started with a career in data and data science. We touch upon nuanced areas, data where it's overrated or overglorified, mistakes, perspectives, future and AI, amongst other things. The goal is basically to just ask some open ended, hard questions and honest questions about data, business, and everything in between to develop a sense of not being left out because of all the things that are moving in the world. Today with us, we have Ant Murphy. Ant is a product coach and the founder of Product Pathways, which is a self-paced learning platform offering beginner to advanced bite-sized courses. Ant has deep exposure to banking, business analysis, data, product management, and has even served in the Australian military. Welcome to the show, Ant. How are you doing today?
I'm great, thank you. Yeah, varied background.
No, love to I'm so happy that we are finally doing this in a recorded fashion so that we can like share some nuggets out of whatever everyone keeps learning through your newsletters and so on. I'm going to just start with a very simple question. I'm personally curious about how you have seen everything through the last decade. There's been a lot of evolution. We have been seeing new technology pop up and so on, and suddenly it looks like AI is probably creating that impact of this is the kind of change or the scale of change that we have never seen before. And that's sort of worrisome for some people. They feel that they're getting left out. That's sometimes an opportunity for some people. You do product pathways. How has your perspective been on the whole technological landscape? And from therein, we can maybe even dive into the story behind product pathways.
Yeah, so definitely feels like another wave, kind of like Internet 2.0 type situation where there's another, maybe a spike in acceleration. So if you think about like growth curve and we're just getting steep all of a sudden, definitely feels like another one of them. And to that degree, though, digital acceleration's been pretty fast over the last decade. Like, obviously we're spiking, but like a lot has happened. Like I've got like this smartwatch on, and phones, Internet of Things have all come about. The internet has gotten more crazy. SaaS, social networks, a lot has kind of happened. I think for me, what do I think about it? I think change happens all the time. You can't prepare for these types of spikes. They're going to happen. Like you can't predict, I should say. You can prepare. You can't predict when one of these spikes are going to happen. But I think from a business and product context, the important part is to think about. So this is something I spend a lot of time with my clients with is, like if you just take like a three horizon model, we'll just go with a simple one. You've got like horizon one, two, and three. If you're not playing in those further horizons, eventually that horizon is going to become, so horizon three will eventually become horizon one. And if you haven't
Yeah,
played in that space, then you're not prepared for it. That's what I meant by you can't predict it, but you can prepare for it. And
yeah,
I've done work with, so as one of my clients was doing work in this AI 3D kind of animation space, and that was pre Chat GPT, and that was also pre Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook rebranding himself to Meta. So they were kind of playing in that space, and then that all happened, and then they kind of rode that wave a little bit more, and they're still riding the wave, and we'll see where they go. But I think that's a good example of playing in that space and preparing for it. Then you can kind of ride the wave, as opposed to the companies that didn't. The wave comes, and then they're kind of playing catch up. Yeah,
yeah. I think one particular thought that stood out for me, and I read your newsletters very often. So I think you were quoting Jeff Bezos, if I remember
yeah,
it right, wherein you said that he, at one point in time, and I think I've seen that talk as well, where he goes and mentions that think in terms of decades, not years. And he's talking about like how Amazon has had a great quarterly performance, but then he very casually goes and says that, this quarter was planned like 3 years back. And the question essentially here is how can someone think in terms of decades today where things are changing so fast that you don't even know what is going to be like the norm. And the way I look at it personally, I think and I am very bullish on the fact that AI would probably change as much in the next 10 years as we have
mm,
probably seen in the last 25 or maybe more. And that's insane. Like I can't even perceive what all is gonna change. So as you spend time with product people, how are people thinking about it? How do you recommend someone thinks in terms of decades and not years?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think it's going to go through like this is just the beginning. It'll be so different in 10 years' time. Very hard to picture that. I think I mean, this is the hard part about strategy and probably business and product in general, right? Like the future is inherently uncertain. So you can't predict the future. But what I think you can do is you can spend time trying to reflect and understand. And when I talk a lot about strategy, I talk about building strategic narratives. Not a new concept. A lot of people talk about that, but it really resonates with me. And the notion being that we need to form narratives about not only what has come about in the past that's led to today's situation, but also to build a narrative of what the future might hold as a result of all that. Now,
Yeah,
obviously, that's going to be based on a level of assumptions, a level of beliefs, and just stuff that you just can't know for certain because it's the future. But
yeah,
the past half, you can base it off real data. You can base it off real insights. You can base it off trends. You can base it off those types of things. So you kind of have this mix, and maybe it's a mix of the art and the science coming together, right? Where the science of looking at the past and the data and looking at the preconditions that led to today and making that analysis and drawing insights from that and building a narrative as well
yeah,
as trying to project a narrative into the future of that, which that is going to be inherently uncertain. Uh, the part of like looking into the future is to not be afraid to do that. I think sometimes we want certainty, so we get
yeah,
stuck in the present because we're just looking at the numbers and the data and the things that we can actually know. We need to accept that there's a level of uncertainty. We need to accept that business is placing a lot of bets. I know when I use the
yeah,
terminology and others do, some people don't like it. They don't resonate with it because they think like it's like you're betting, but you are. Like I'm putting, for some companies, you're putting millions of dollars into something and we don't know if it's going to be successful. I mean, Amazon launched what do they call it? The Fire something, the phone. It was called like a Fire.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And Fire
yeah.
Stick.
Yeah, that's it. And like they put millions of dollars into that, and that was a bomb, right? So you got to accept that that's part of the puzzle. I think what you can do though is when you do model that future, it's important that you have conviction around that. So you should believe in it. It's hard to rally somebody behind that if you don't even believe in it, right? Um, the
Yeah,
more data you can get on the past to support that prediction of the future, the better you're going to be. But also, I think the last thing is to be able to have mechanisms to be able to pivot when things do change. So if you do think like, I don't know, OpenAI is going to go down some path and ChatGPT is going to do this and that type of stuff, have conviction about that, but then also be open to the idea that, hey, we could get 2, 3 years later and something completely new could come. And I'm prepared as a business, as a product to be able to pivot and make those changes. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, couldn't agree more. Like, so looking back to look forward, that's a topic that's very, very, very much what I sleep on as a founder every day. And you can never like really feel that you have thought about it deep enough. Like, there's always this sense of, oh, there's something that I'm maybe missing on. But I'm gonna circle back to this point because it ties to like the broader agenda I have with your chat and this episode in general. But I wanna go back first to product pathways. You just talked about the last decade and like change has always been happening. Somewhere in that journey you ended up starting product pathways. Like, why did you start it? What's the story behind it? How has the journey scaling it been?
Yeah, it's so great question. The idea or the genesis of product pathways was probably 4+ years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And I only launched it less than 12 months ago, right? Although I've been working on it I like silently launched it probably 2 years ago or 18 months ago, but actually launched the first one like 9 months ago. Um, the idea came about because I ended up in an agency. So I was a product manager working with different clients, and I wasn't in house anymore. So I was working with clients. And what I found was I was working with all these different teams and all these different companies, and I was having the same conversation over and over again. And I felt like I was on
Yeah,
repeat. And there's an element of you, right? Like that you're always trying to optimize, or you think like, if I keep having the same conversation, then clearly like there's a gap, right? There's an unmet need
yeah,
there. And I also thought, well, how do I optimize it? Because like, how do I just stop having the same conversation over and over again? And
Yeah.
those thoughts led me to this idea of being able to essentially, I was like, why don't I just record myself and I could do videos? And then that kind of led down a path of, you start to potentially solution around it. And you're like, well, I could do like YouTube videos and stuff. Anyways, around the same time, I started writing content. So that's when I started my newsletter, which wasn't a newsletter back then. It was a Medium blog. And I started writing content. And that was kind of like I guess my MVP of what eventually
Yeah.
became Product Pathways, although it has become a newsletter now too. But I don't know. I got to a point in my career where I was trying to, I guess I was doing a lot of exploratory parts of my career. I chased a lot of things that I was interested in. And I found this happy middle ground where I'm super interested in product and business and leadership as well. Things are very tied together, but I love helping people as well. So
Yeah.
when I started blogging, and the idea of even recording myself was just like, how do I help How do I help more people? That was my train of thought, was how do I help more people do product better? And over the years of that, that led me to starting my own business of coaching and consulting. So then that's was kind of the first step, was actually then why don't I just work with individual people, work with companies? I can run training for them, workshops for them. I can come in and consult and give advice, and I can help them do product better. And then the journey kind of went along that, and it was like, well, how do I scale that? Really was the train of thought, because one-to-one conversation is great, and it's really impactful, but it's
Yeah.
one-to-one. How do I go one to many? And
Right.
a blog and a newsletter is a path to go one to many. Videos is a path to go one to many. Training courses and live courses is a path to go to one to many. And product pathways is a path to go to one to many. Ultimately, my underlining, I guess, belief, and talk about conviction, right? So here's a belief, right? Um, the world is changing, yes, and the technology today has far greater impact in our lives than it ever has. You look
Yeah.
at things like even the watches, right? Like these things can predict when you're in a car accident, or they can, predict, bad rhythms in your what arrhythmia in your heart
Yeah.
and stuff. They can predict people falling over. It has a huge impact. It also has the other consequence too, like a positive impact
Yeah.
can also have a negative impact. But I'm a belief that that's only going to accelerate, right? And we'll see with AI too. It will impact and infiltrate our lives, and that's only going to continue. I also believe that the core to building good products and products that have that more positive impact than the negative impact lies in people like you, lies in people like the people listening to this, great product people, people who actually care and want to solve real problems and build great things. And I believe that I can play a part in the world to help those people do that. And that's kind of the foundation of product pathways. Yeah.
And so, as you were talking about this whole journey that you had, I was wondering, when you are faced with the question of scaling up, right? Like, and a lot of founders end up getting trapped because they have raised money, let's say from a VC, and then they just realize that, oh my God, the dreamland that we were hoping it would be, it's pretty far off from there. And I was talking to a friend who went that route, and with a lot of effort, he ended up returning the money to the VC to
Mm.
start his own lifestyle business. And today he's doing pretty well in terms of like, because now it's just him and his expenses and whatever he has to manage. From that level and lens, he was anyway seeking freedom, and he's traveling around the world doing a lot of things as he goes by. Now, when you were talking about scaling product pathways, I was wondering if you ever thought of making it into a more traditional company, going the VC route and doing things with it, because naturally you were working with a whole bunch of people doing the same. Hey, I'm going to coach you, I'm going to help you strategize here, I'm going to help you develop a PLG motion and whatnot. Was it a very conscious choice to do it as a solopreneur of sorts, or for that matter, like more of like not as a traditional business?
So yes, is probably the short answer. I saw this really good tweet. I don't remember who it was from, so I apologize. But it said something like, it was a thread. It was like, I quit my job to start my, because I didn't want to work for somebody else. And I started a company. I raised X million dollars. And then I was miserable because I worked for all the investors. I sold that company. I then started my own company on my own investment. And now I finally work for myself. I agree. I talk to a lot of founders and a lot of and same similar situation, right? Like once you bring that investment in, it's a double edged sword. Now, I don't think there's a right or wrong. I'm not adverse
Yeah.
against investment, right? I think it depends on there's a strategy question. Like, what do you want, right? Like, what do you want to get out of it? Even like your friend you were saying there, like, what type of lifestyle do you want to have? Because there's
Yeah.
more to it, right? There's more to just, oh, I want to build a unicorn business. Well, if you want to do that, you probably need to go down the VC funding route. Like, it's just the fact because the money's going to help you accelerate that and kind of make some leapfrogs towards that. Not to say you can't do it because plenty of people have achieved it bootstrapped, but you're in for a long journey if you're going to bootstrap it. But that's part of it too. Like, is this something that I want to grow and live with for the next 30, 40, 50 years till you basically pass away, right?
Yeah.
Or is it something that you're just trying to scale up, sell it, exit? Like there's a lot of questions in it that are going to make differences between which path you're going to go down. For me, um, part of it was not the whole like working for investors and those types of things. I think a lot of it to me was being able to have my own say. I'm also just a big fan of bootstrapped businesses personally, and it's
Mm,
not it's a personal bias, and I just find it more fascinating because I think it's a tougher challenge to solve, right? And
yeah.
I also think that funding, again, I'm not averse to funding, but I've also worked with clients which there's the concept of default alive or default dead in startups.
Mhm.
So default alive means that if funding got cut tomorrow, like if you didn't raise your next series C or D or whatever, would you still have a company? And then
Yeah.
default dead is we live on the funding because we don't have a profitable business. So as soon as the funding goes, we're dead. I
Yeah.
think that that's a very dangerous place to be in. And over the
Yeah.
last couple of years, we've seen a huge influx in VC money. It's kind of gone crazy, particularly the last decade or less, like the last 5 years, well, decade. Um, it's gone a little too crazy. And I think a lot of people are default dead. And personally, I wouldn't be proud of a business that's default dead. I'll be proud of a
Yeah.
business that's default alive and 10% of valued at 10% or less than, default dead business. I'll take $1 million business over $100 million business that's default alive over default dead.
Yeah.
Personally, but that's a personal
Yeah.
thing.
No, 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 absolutely. And I think as I reflect back on what you were just saying, in fact, it's becoming evident now. A lot of venture backed businesses, not only like even VC firms for that matter, are facing difficulties. A lot of them are up for a toss. They are finding that they have not been able to deliver on the promises. And I think it was mostly because of that irrationality that came in the last like 4 or 5 years, wherein money was flowing all around.
Yeah,
A lot of people ended up just picking random partners. VCs are super. Like, of course, there is a set of independence that you have when you're trying to do a solo business. And I love how you put it, that it's ultimately the question of what you want to do, how much you want to scale that, to what extent, what are your goals, what is the lifestyle that you are preferring to live in. But once you go even the VC route, there are amazing openings or possibilities, and people who really understand, people who back you, not for the fact that, oh, you're going to give a 10x return only the next day. It's also for the fact that they believe in who you are, and they're going to back you even if you like sort of go away with whatever you were doing, that idea doesn't pan out, and let's say the money is lost. They would still back you because they backed you for the first place for the person you were. But picking that VC is very tricky. And the funding summer as well, where everyone was raising money, you could raise money from any random VC for sure, but raising money from the VC that you should be raising is still challenging. It was still challenging then, and it will continue to be challenging. So that's a lens that I personally have developed as I went the VC route while that was happening. But I see, and that's partly the reason why I see a lot of founders now even having that itch or like that side hustle on their end, where they're trying new things and so on. But on that note, and you interact with a lot of product managers. I think yesterday night I was reading this Gartner report where they actually go in and say that by 2030, 80% of product management tasks they see being done by AI. I like, of course, Gartner may have its own base to say why and why that may happen and why that may not happen. But in general, as I have interacted with product managers, whether it's in relation with Crunch or whatever we are building, abs- I feel that there's this feeling of being left out because of all that is changing because of AI. And as we are talking about these technological changes, and for that matter, how you are scaling product pathways, I want to understand how has your interaction been in general with AI, and on top, because you work with product people, how should people prepare for AI first future? Like, what would you tell them to focus on?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing to say 80% of tasks will be taken by AI. That'll be interesting to see pan out what it would end up panning out to be. I think it's an interesting one to me because even if it's like, there's like the Patio principle, right? Like, so even if 80% of tasks were automated, like that 20% that can't be automated or can't be, I shouldn't say automated, can't be replaced by AI. Um, Maybe that 20% is actually the 20% that gives the 80% of value. Does that make sense? So
Yeah,
maybe, there's a future where that's a good thing. Like we're actually outsourcing all of these small, things that we need to do, that is painful tasks that are fall in the 80% that yield 20%. And if we can create more time and space for the 20%, and imagine being able to spend twice as much time on the 20%, like even just that as a concept. If as product people, we can spend twice as much time on the 20% that really matters. Like, I think that's a huge unlock for businesses, and I think that's a huge unlock for products and everything a lot, in general. So there's a part of me that's like, don't fear it for that sense, right? I think we get scared because we think our roles are going to go away. We think that businesses will think, well, if there's only 20% left, then we can fire 80% of the product managers, and we can. But I don't think that that's going to end up being the case. We will see. That's just my belief. I could be wrong, but we'll see. I think the role will stick around. I think that 20% is going to be very valuable. Things like strategy that we've already talked about, like making these choices and thinking about these things, like even the VC versus not VC, like, you know AI can kind of give you pros and cons, but at the end of the day, you've got to make that decision. What do I want to do? What do you know what values do I have for this business? And be based on those values and those principles and that vision that I want to have on it, and all the other inputs, well, what decision am I going to make? And I don't think
yeah,
AI is going to be able to do that, or at least I don't think outsourcing that to AI is a good idea either. Because what about if you make the decision and then it doesn't go how you hoped it would? What are you going to do then? Blame AI, or are you going to, just take responsibility for it and then, pivot and make changes yourself? So
yeah,
I think you also asked the question about, I guess, the sentiment. I think I'm seeing people just be uncertain, and I think a lot of people worried that the role's going away. I think it's being mixed with, we see things like, it's been in the news, companies, getting rid of product managers. Part of that is financial, right? Like, we're in a downturn, so companies are going to downsize during a downturn. Investment's going to lower too, so that's another thing with the default dead versus default alive. Like, that's a risk you take by being default dead. Obviously, calculated risk. There's plenty of situations where that risk makes total sense. Um, so I think that's being mixed together. So then I think there's extra fear, and we see all companies are downsizing and AI is going at the same time. Do I truly believe that those two things are happening because of AI? Like, are they linked together? No. I don't think companies have gotten to the point where they're like, oh, AI is doing 50% of product managers' tasks, and therefore we're going to get rid of half of them. I think the downsizing is happening because of the economy and just the downturn. Final thing, just thinking about the other questions you asked, advice. My advice is always to just focus on what you can control.
yeah,
So if 80% get outsourced, right? Well, what's that 20%? How do you make that 20% really, really good and show your value there and show how important that 20% is? And again, like I said, view it as an opportunity. I think you can view all these things as opportunities. It's an opportunity for your product. How do we leverage AI? It's an opportunity for you. How do I get rid of all these menial tasks that I don't like doing, and I can spend more time doing strategy and talking to customers and those types of things? And then how do I prove value in those things? And if I can spend twice as much time in those things and I can give the business more than a 2x return on that, then they're going to keep
Yeah,
me. They're not going to fire any product manager, then, right? Are they? They're going to keep them
absolutely.
all. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm, 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 I'm trying to picture what is in that 80% that's likely going to get replaced. Because I agree with you that 20% may be giving 80% of the value. So that statement in its own silo may not really mean anything. But to all the product folks who are listening to this, what are the domains that you definitely see getting replaced in the future? And that is with the lens of an advice that we should ideally also have for them is that move towards going into that 20% bucket, like learn the skills, work, gain enough experience, gain context, work with leaders, understand how someone can just like, you can't wake up and say, oh, I'm going to do strategy. You need to like grow into a role that is dealing with strategies. You will likely make mistakes. You need to have that buffer before you are making like right good decisions. Majority of the decisions would be right, you'd still be making some wrong ones. But what are those domains which are definitely gonna get replaced? If you can just list out a couple of them so that people who are listening to them would know that okay, they have some work to do.
Yeah, yeah. I definitely was thinking it might be easier to think about the spaces that wouldn't be replaced, like strategy, definitely not. The communication, influencing, the leadership aspects. How do you influence inside an organization and rally an organization towards a vision or something like that? Those things aren't going to get replaced. Even talking to customers, I don't think, and observing customers won't. I think so. We can start touching on elements that might get replaced. Some spaces around talking to your customers might, like, AI
Yeah,
can do some things about, it could generate surveys for you, as an example. It could help you generate better interview questions. Could it conduct the interview for you? Not yet. Could it in the future? Potentially. um, so maybe, but there's a lot more to than just asking questions. Like, depending
yeah,
on your interview and technique, right? Like, if you use contextual inquiry or something, then you're mixing observation with questions. You're not just asking questions. So then, can
yeah,
AI do both? Maybe in the future, but not yet, right? So
yeah,
I think there's those elements. It could help. So I think a lot of it's going to be like time consuming things and saving time. So if you think about a survey, we just talked about that. It could help you produce a survey. Do I think it's going to produce the perfect survey? No. Do I think it can get you 80% there and then you can refine the last 20%? Yes. And then so something that took you 2 hours to do now takes you 20 minutes, half an hour. Um, Other things could be, I mean, I've been seeing things out there about like user stories being generated or tasks being generated. I think, again, those things can help. Like, if you have, here's the spec, and it can kind of go, okay, based on the spec, I think you can slice it this way. And then these are the tasks that we can build it. I think those things can help. Again, will it be perfect? Maybe not. Maybe you still need to do the last 20% on top of it. Uh, Little time consuming things, like we spend time on release notes, on email
yeah,
comms to customers, support, even like insights and synthesis. I think being able to crunch data and say, based on, so if you put 20 customer interviews into it, it could say, based on these customer interviews, here's some of the common thematics. And that can just save you, again, 20 minutes of you having to do it. Again, will
yeah,
it be perfect? Unsure. It'll get better over time. But I think those things are the things that are definitely in the space of being automated. This, obviously, we talked about the stuff that's not. Yeah, I would lean more towards the things that are harder to. I often think about what is more simple and just time consuming versus the things that are more complex and creative. Things that are more complex and
yeah,
creative is going to be harder for AI to do. The more simple things, like turn this into release notes and time consuming,
yeah,
it's definitely going to do that. And it's a big unlock,
yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but I want to specifically dive on one domain, which is data, because a lot of our listeners are also data folks. Now, it's surprising if you just think about how AI has impacted our workflows. We are mostly playing with, oh, write this piece of content for me, do this search for me, do a summation of this, like the very basic capabilities. But what, or if someone understands LLMs and what they are really good at, they're exceptionally good at doing mathematical calculations. If you are giving them the right instructions, they will do very good mathematical calculations. But surprisingly, for the first 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, when the hype was all about, oh, I'm also building this thing using ChatGPT or like a thin wrapper around it, most of the products were not actually about making life with data easier. And then I started diving deeper into it. Why? Because that seems very counterintuitive. And what I realized was that there are a couple of problems. So the first is most of the product managers as well, let alone data analysts or business analysts, they are not business literate. What I mean by that is, you know what your job is, but making sense out of it. And part of it ultimately ends up moving into the role of, can you be a strategist or not, as far as a business goes. But most of them know what data is, they don't know what to make sense out of, like, and how where there is a hidden signal, where should they go about putting more time or energy. The second was, in general, this thing about issues in data, as in, like, maybe you have a couple of warehouses, you are a product led growth company, so PLG motion exists, and you're suddenly seeing data coming in from your marketing warehouse, and there's data sitting in sales warehouse, but there is no unique identifier that will help you marry the two data sets. Or for that matter, the funnel is breaking, but that data is maybe sitting somewhere else and no one knows how to query that, or you're just out of time. And that whole aspect of cleaning it and going and answering something once the data is in the right format is easy, but the cleaning aspect, or like the dirty work of collating where the query needs to be done, or for that even making sense that, okay, let's say if we are saying how to increase our revenue, here is what we need to look at, that is largely lacking. What are your thoughts on that? Like, how should people, because it's evident that analysts, their job, to a large extent, the workflows that they're going through, they will largely be empowered by AI. It's still not there yet. Like, a lot of tools are adding AI capabilities, they are not there yet, they're still seeing issues. And that's largely because of, for example, if some sales team is, let's say, generating sales data, that data itself is contaminated or it's not accurate, and that business analyst who is there knows that, oh, 2 years back when this happened, here is the context that I need to account for, so let's exclude this particular data set for this day or something like that. But AI is not there yet. And how should people who are working with data, specifically product people, how should they think about this shift? How should they ensure that they are still relevant, let's say a decade later, with all the advancements that would happen on the data front?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think there's this really fascinating possibility in the future where, imagine a model or AI being able to take in all the business data, right? Like you can, all the customer data, or the product data, or the business data, and being able to make suggestions. I think that's a fascinating space. I agree with you that a lot of these data sit in all these different systems, and it's an integration nightmare. And maybe, I think some analytics companies that have most of the data already, the opportunity probably lies with them to do something as opposed to somebody else, like a third party. Not saying that that's not impossible. I think you still could, but I do think that's a fascinating space. I, however, though, believe that the best businesses and the best products and the best founders, product people, etc., they are data informed, not data driven. So,
Yeah.
and many people listening probably have heard that concept before, right? So, what I mean by that in the context of this will be, AI will serve you up about a whole bunch of things, like these are some insights. I think you should do this, or this is a problem. If you fix this, you could generate X amount of revenue. Someone still needs to look at that. Someone still needs to make a decision on top of that. And I think will be interesting to see. I've thought about this. It'll be interesting to see the next decade or so, or a couple of decades, with companies, and how many companies will just blindly listen to the AI. And it'll be
Yeah.
interesting to see how they go and their performance, and how other companies will perform that don't. My hypothesis would be the companies that just blindly follow it will kind of chase the squeaky wheel, so to speak, right? Like just always putting oil on the squeaky wheel. And back to what we talked about at the beginning about thinking about a decade or more and thinking in the future, and they're going to lack those things. And I think they're going to be very short term driven, but that's my hypothesis. Um, for product people, I think what you should be focusing on is, how do I still have the knowledge to be
Yeah.
able to look at the data to look at the recommendations that the AI is giving me, to interrogate it, to ask the right questions so I can be data informed and not data driven. And I'll give just a simple example. I think the best product people are very curious, and they're curious not just in the sense of, oh, why is our customers doing that, or why is there a drop off here, or why what's happening with AI. They're not just curious about that. They're also curious when they look at things like data. So the data might say, oh, 80% of your customers have this problem, and then AI might be giving you some suggestion. But the curious product manager will look at that and say, and a good product manager will look at that and say, okay, is it really 80%? Like, where did they get that data from? Like,
Yeah.
what do they base that data off? Is that actually like significant in this, like, from a statistics point of view? Is it, it's saying 80%, but was that all of our customers surveyed, or was that X amount, or is that, was the survey biased? Like, what questions did you ask? What, et cetera, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's where you're still going to play. And I think that's where you need to focus, have enough knowledge around those things to be able to ask those right questions and then interrogate it. And then you can tweak the model, right? Like exclude this, exclude that, change that. Yeah.
Yeah, but now I want to touch back on the point we left earlier. So, which was about looking back to look forward. I think you have an article or a blog post. It's probably titled "The Edge Effect," where you talk about what we can learn from uh, nature as far as innovation goes. And we were just talking back on what can we learn from whatever has happened in the past, and then like have a very first principle thinking in terms of what's not going to change, have that as the baseline as opposed to what's going to change, and then strategize how you want to go about it. But on that particular article, first of all, what is that about? Like, what is the edge effect? Can you just talk briefly about it and how it's relevant to whatever we are just discussing now?
Yeah. So Edge Effect. Yeah, I think it's like lessons on innovation from the Edge Effect or something. I titled that post. So the Edge Effect is actually a natural phenomena. It happens in the environment. So it's a geological term. Basically, what it is two diverse environments meet. So the most extreme case would be like a desert meet in a rainforest. But there's plenty of other examples, like the ocean meet in a desert, or like the ocean meet in something else, or rainforest meet in something else. But it's when those two things meet, it actually forms this concept known as an edge effect, where there's a piece of land or geology that where the two overlap. And inside that edge effect, it hosts the most diverse, like fauna, flora, animals, and you name it. It's one of the most biodiverse spaces inside the world. So if you pick all these edge effects around the world, they are the most biodiverse and the most rich. Now, why I talk about that and I like using the analogy is because product and the work that we do is the same. So we want to look for these edge effects in our product work. So when we're looking at data, so this is a good example. In a way, you actually want to look for these edge effects. So there's a few different types of edge effects that I look out for inside data and discovery. One of them being is when there's contradictions. So
Yeah.
let's say, X number of people say this is the best thing, they love it, they use it a lot, and then X number of people never use it. Why is that the case?
Yeah.
And rather than just looking at it and saying, well, those people aren't our target, let's just ignore them, it's an edge effect. There is something there that is, it's painful for one cohort and it's the best thing for another cohort. Why is that the case? And then we can really challenge ourselves to say, not either or, but to say, and how might we solve this pain while still giving this gain? And if we can do that and bring those two things together, we have an edge effect. And it's often where innovation lies. And that's one of the lessons there is innovation often lies in these types of constraints.
Yeah.
Other edge effects would be constraints, and another one would be outliers. So sometimes there's like this weird outlier on the edge, and you're like, okay, it's easy to say, oh, it's 2% of customers, let's just ignore it. But you should probably eventually, at some point, invest a bit of time to explore, well, what is happening there? Why is that 2%? And there's been great examples of inventions like penicillin and even Viagra and all these other like things, even in the medical world, that have come out from these edge effects. Sleeping pills as well. one of them, I'm trying to remember the name of it, but it was developed as like it was meant to help you with like a flu. It was like a something to help your immune
Hmm.
system, but people were falling asleep in the middle of the day, so they thought, well, that sucks. But then some other people came along and looked at it and was like, well, actually, we could repurpose this. We could change it a little bit, and it makes a really good sleeping pill. And then other people repackaged it, and it got turned into the nightcap drug. Where you take it just before you go to sleep. So it helps your immune system and your sleep. Edge effects, they're great opportunities rather than just discarding it and ignoring it, right? Like, we just won't use it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it particularly stuck with me when I read it. I was thinking that to a large extent, everyone who's feeling left out or who's feeling that, oh my God, something is changing, it's out of my control. If you reimagine things with the lens of how you were explaining, and to me, the most contrasting image is like, so recently there was a volcano eruption in Iceland, and at one point in time, there was this like lava meeting with a water body with ice and whatnot. And is beautiful because you won't imagine lava and snow existing together. But there was this edge that was forming. And I was researching about that a little bit in terms of how it happens. There's actually a very chemical process that takes place before, like, that example of biodiversity thriving or like flora and fauna popping in. And to a large extent, all of us are pretty much on that edge right now. It's that phase where things are changing. Some of it will not be as relevant of a change, but if we just start re-looking at whatever has happened in the past, look at both the sides, what is the future going to hold, what has happened in the past, and where am I, maybe it starts becoming much more clear. And that has helped me personally a lot. So I love that article or that piece of yours. But and I have to ask you one thing. So you work with companies that have a PLG motion, right? Like, and they are very data heavy. Like a traditional B2B company is largely run on relationships as well. An enterprise company, there's a lot like you could do. I was speaking to someone, we were talking about their retention problem, and they were like, hey, you know what? What's interesting is we do everything right, and we are still seeing churn. And I was like, what do you mean? They're like, you go look at the data, you go look at the effort, you go look at the product, you go look at the response when somebody raised a support ticket, you go look at how our success managers have followed up, and you will not find anything that you can point a finger to saying this is why it went down. Everything was done as per the script. We were accounting for newer things, we were very fluid, but then we still lost it because it was a pricing war, right? Like someone came up with a better offering, and in that context the conversation moved about how AI is getting so powerful that for every enterprise that exists today, there is this whole idea of, are we also going to see newer products gonna get adopted, or are we going to see more of experts who come in and help the enterprise develop things in house? Now, why would an enterprise develop things in house? That's like counterintuitive. Again, enterprises love using products from outside as long as there's like a security clause and everything there. As long as those standards are met, they mostly don't develop tools in house unless needed. But in this scenario, with AI's capability, everything that is being paid for today is going to become extremely cheap to build in house. And if it's going to become extremely cheap to build in house, every enterprise is going to do it any which way because people today expect more for every dollar of payment. There was like net ARR retention is very, very tough to come by. Now, like you will see that is going down. And essentially, if everyone is going to go on a price war, more and more people would start building things in house because that's a way for them to save costs. So I was reflecting on this whole evolution that's happening around us, and there are companies popping left, right, and center. There are people who start out thinking that, oh, this is a great niche, and then they start and realize, oh, it looked more glorious. Things are not that easy. Maybe there are like 10 other people doing it, and whatever domain you pick, there are like five people who have tried it. They may have failed, and maybe you would succeed because you have a better strategy or a better product, or maybe the timing is right, or sometimes the luck is in your favor. But for someone who's starting out today, right, like how would you say they think about the unmet needs, whether that person is a product person starting a venture backed business or starting a bootstrap business, or it's a serial founder who's doing it? given that everything is happening today, how would you say they should think about what's going to be relevant? Like, how do they niche down? How do they identify their niche? What is that pain point? Should they be looking at more verticalized offerings? What is that whole mindset? Can you walk us through that in terms of based on whatever experiences you have garnered over the years?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in that, and I think so. I'm unpacking it. A few things to kind of start with. I mean, like, so if you think about some of the things you mentioned, like the landscape's changing, the cost is going down. That's always been the case to a degree. Technology has enabled things to become cheaper. Technology has enabled people to be able to start companies. So there's more companies than ever today. That also lowers the life expectancy of a company. So there's trends showing that the life expectancy of a company is going down. I think like, what was it? It was the top 100 or something in the US are like it's down to like 12 years or 16 years or something, and it used to be like
Yeah,
50
yeah.
years ago it was like almost 100 years or something. Anyways, don't quote me on it, but all those things are going down. Price wars are a very dangerous place to play. When you end up in the space where the only thing when it comes down to price, I mean, there's a few dynamics there. Like some industries are a price based industry. There's just no two ways about that. Um, but if you can generally, you want to try and position yourself so you're not fighting on price. You actually have some type of unique thing and a target customer that makes them less price sensitive. But I think that's another space to think about. And to be honest, I think if you end up in one of those spaces, or if you're going to start something and you realize that it is a price based industry, I'd probably bail out and go look for something else or try and pivot the product or something like that. But if you're starting, there's a few things you can think about, and some of the things I think about, and some of the things I work with my clients to think about. One of it is again to build models of the past, look backwards, to look forward. So what is happening? What are the trends happening? You can even get data. So like, there's a really good interview with Jeff Bezos, like back in the '90s, when they asked him about Amazon, and he said he read some statistic in his job which showed like the internet was growing like 2,000 something percent a year, and that basically made him quit his job. And he's like, something's
Yeah.
growing that fast, like that's the future and we should go into it. Again, look backwards to look forwards, and again have conviction, right? Like he had this belief that it's growing so fast, I
Yeah.
should get into it. So that's a model you can look at. It's like, well, what trends are happening? Like, okay, AI is growing that fast. So maybe that's a space to get into the future. Also got to remember, Jeff did that in the '90s, and it was only like 10, like it took him 10, 20 years until he really became big and a household name. So it's sometimes, again, timing comes into it. So you might jump into the trend really early and then you got to wait. Sometimes you might come in at the right time and you can ride that wave. But that's something to look at. And from an unmet needs point of view, a lot of it just comes down to starting with some good discovery and doing some research. You're going to look at some of these trends and then you're going to have some hypotheses about them. So I believe the internet is growing, then you'll have some other assumptions around that, like people would be comfortable with buying stuff online, et cetera, et cetera. Then go and try and validate those things. I think that's always the most important thing to start off with, is actually go and do that. Because if you can, it's way cheaper to go talk to a dozen people um, and talk to, and you said you've done heaps of calls, right, recently. And, to do exactly that, that's cheaper for you to do than to actually invest all this money to build something and then find out that nobody wanted it. So it's cheaper
Yeah.
to do that. And what you're looking for is, I'd be looking for those edge effects, right? I'll be looking for those unmet needs and those outliers. Like, what is something that's underserved, no one's doing because people are ignoring those outliers? And those outliers present an opportunity for you. And I think having that framing as a product person is probably a very powerful thing. Thinking about it now, because always having that framing of viewing things as opportunities, not as like, oh, I've just got to ignore that because nobody else is doing it. Well, how just look at it and do some more due diligence around it and dive into it, because it might be gold. And to your question around niching down, that might present your niche because nobody else is
Yeah.
doing AI for yoga instructors or something, right? But
Yeah.
maybe the yoga industry is growing by 50% year on year. AI is growing by 3,000%. Don't quote me on these. I'm just making it up, right? But you look at that, then you look at those things, and you're looking at unmet need and maybe again opportunity. So I'd be doing that. I'll be doing my research. I'll be getting some data. I'll be thinking about how that models into the future and whether I can, yeah, really niche down there. And niching down, I've got a niche canvas as well that it was my last, I think it was my last or second last newsletter post of the year. But yeah, I shared that about like a step by step. You can think about how do I define my niche. Yeah.
Yeah, when I reflect back on my career, initially when I was in the product role and I was working in an enterprise setup, so the luxury I had was that we had like 1,000 customers who were already using some version of our product, and we would build something new, get to these people and go in and say, hey, would you like want to try it, or for that matter, we already knew that somebody needed something and we would build it, and it would often sell like a hot piece of cake, right? Like because we know the customer, we already have a relationship, they are more open. We had is the easy way. Of course it took a lot of effort to get to that spot where you have to build that 1,000 customer base, but in that role as a product person, I remember running into these ideas over blogs and newsletters and like thinking by writing like 10 bullet points on a piece of paper that, oh, I have like $1 million business idea, right? Like, and then when someone is in that lens, they often end up mistaking it for how tough it actually is to start from scratch, where you don't have the luxury of those 1,000 people. Like you may build the exact same product that your company has built, but the company would be able to sell it to someone and you would not be able to sell it because there's a lot many factors that come in other than how exactly the product works or functions as well. So that is like one lens I would often like recommend to product managers and people who are sitting in maybe a startup and thinking like, I have these five kick-ass ideas which would probably become like $1 million or $1 billion businesses. It's very tough. So talking to customers can't be emphasized more. The PMF, like you need to be brutal, brutal, brutal with it. But I have one final question before we go towards the closing, and for you. And this is slightly a question that I myself don't have a good answer to. So uh, I am in the habit of asking this to everyone. AI, everything that we are seeing today, it looks like it's going to be a feature, less of a differentiator, as in everyone expects AI to be there in every product. But most of the interactions that we have seen, maybe whatever Google did with Gemini lately, was like a little bit of glimpse into how there is going to be a multimodal way of interacting. So they had given this video wherein you are sort of not just having text as an input. There's going to be like these cards that that get generated dynamically. You can select them. Basically it's no longer just a chat to interact with AI. But I have at least spoken to 200 people in the last 2 months, as you were just mentioning, and 50 of them have mentioned that they think that text is not the best way to have like a AI first product. Like that there are going to be subtle nuances. Maybe you can get on the context, maybe you can like take an input without a user actually giving you an input, and so on. I just want to ask you, do you have any thoughts on what that future version of UI might be? And it may not be like one thing, like text is going to exist forever. That's going to be true, but it will maybe get augmented with other things. Uh, and I ask this to you because again, you interact a lot with product folks. But
I think text is going to be augmented. It already has. I read this really great article that was like talking about how text based UIs is like the future UI. And this was like 5+ years ago. And they're talking about that, and they're talking about how can get augmented with serving up pictures, and then again, like, is this what you're talking about? And you can select it and giving you options, and you can select options. I think that already exists and that's happening. I do think that that's a step, in a direction or a future direction. What do I believe the future looks like? I don't think I've given too much, like a huge amount of thought into it. So a bit hard for me to answer, but maybe I'll answer it from a client that I had, because they had a
yeah,
belief that the future wasn't chat either. Um, so talk about looking backwards, look forwards, probably a theme across this whole thing that we've talked about. Um, they looked at the trend or the change from phone calls to text. So there was a shift over time where we stopped calling each other's and we started to text. Same thing happened with businesses. Think about like support at the moment. Like sometimes you call up for support, but sometimes you'll just get in the app and go into the support chat and do a chat. Just like there's like support blogs and that type of stuff. And a lot, like, companies like Intercom, right, a multi-billion-dollar company, and that's essentially one of their core products is chat-based support. So there was a trend that changed there. Their belief with AI on the rise, and this they were pre-chat GPT, but they knew that machine learning and AI was an industry that was growing and going to grow and boom. Their belief was that it was going to be speech. So their belief
Mm.
was that text was going to have the same decline as phone, and speech was going to increase. And I guess some of the signals that they were looking at around that was things like Siri, and hopefully Siri doesn't get set off with all my devices in front of me, and like Google and Alexa and everything like that. So they were looking at that, and their belief was that the future generations were going to be much more intuitive with speech. Speech-based interactions was going to improve, because why hasn't speech until very recently been big? Well, it's because it sucked. Like you would talk to it and it wouldn't understand you. Do you remember those phone calls we used to do? Like, even 10 years ago,
Yeah.
sometimes you call up, they'll
Yeah.
say, can you yes or no? And you're like, yes. And they're like, I didn't understand you. And you're like, yes, yes. How many times? Yeah, right. That's improved a lot. So,
Yeah.
and their belief is it's only going to improve even more. And their belief was the future will be a mix of UI still, whether that's augmented
Yeah.
reality, virtual reality, or even our screen, and a still text would exist, but a predominantly voice based. That's their belief, and
Got
that's their company is focused on those types of things. So yeah.
No, yeah, I think this is a very good analogy, but a very uh, something that I have been sleeping on a lot lately, and I still don't have a good answer to it because, of course, we are building a product and we want to build something that's relevant. But and I have one closing question for you. Thank you so much for doing this. In general, as you have seen everything evolve, you have built and scaled things. Any learning you have had that you would like to share with our audience? This is a question that I ask every one of my speakers. It turns into a fabulous compilation as well towards the end. But any learning that you have had that particularly you'd like to share?
Yeah, some of the main ones that come to mind, and you touched on it about how hard it is. You're right. Like in a company, and this is where that Jeff Bezos quote is so good. Is the reason why the company it sells like hotcakes is because that product idea has been years in the making, and now they haven't worked on that specific product, but they've built a user base, they've built a
Yeah,
brand, they've built a, yeah, and you're leveraging all those things. And you're right. When you start from scratch, it's so hard. You don't have any of that. So I think a big learning for me is that
yeah,
it's super hard at the beginning. My other learning is that things take a lot of time, take far longer than you want it to. I think the whole notion of, and that's why I did that newsletter post about thinking in decades and everything, is because I think that's been a big learning for me, especially over the last couple of years. And I talked about my first business when I was in university, and I gave up on it during that newsletter post, and I really shouldn't have given up on it. But we live and we learn. And I think that's a lot of it is a lot of people give up, and a lot of it's just how do I stick with it, stick with the grind, and to know that no one's perfect. And that feeling that you're having right now of doubt and uncertainty and struggle, and am I doing the right thing? Am I not doing the right thing? Oh, this could be better and that could be better. And oh, I could have 2x revenue this month if I just did this. Every other person, product person, founder is all going through that at the same time. They're all having the same thought. I think that's a big one for me. And maybe the last one I'll leave on is that to think about that opportunity, like think
yeah,
and not either or, view things as opportunities. And if you do that, you'll be surprised at how much you can actually control and how much you can influence. I think we sometimes
yeah,
get ourselves in the corner of thinking, oh, I can't do that, or I don't have control of that, and I don't know, like AI, right? Like I don't have control over AI. Well, what do you have control of? Well, you have control of learning about it, you have control of reading about it, you have control of listening to this and talking to people, you have control of even trying to build something. Like, yeah, so you end up being surprised. I've always been pleasantly surprised. And when I work with even product managers in companies and with leaders and stuff, when you start to approach it with this mindset, they're like, oh, actually we can do this and we can do that. Suddenly they're not blocked anymore, right? Like we're not stuck anymore.
yeah,
There's things we can do. there's always things you can do. There's always more you can control. Yeah.
Yeah, that's probably the best way I could think of closing this. But I love how you mentioned the theme essentially is look back to look forward. And thank you so much for doing this. It was an absolute pleasure having you here. And uh, I hope you enjoyed the chat as well. But if someone in our audience wants to reach out to you, where should they find you?
Yeah, I very much enjoyed the chat. I love it. I love nerding out on these things with people. You can tell I'm very passionate about this. Probably very much like you. This is what I do in my spare time. I'm like reading about business models and stuff. Very boring life. But if people want to reach out to me, socials is probably the easiest way. So LinkedIn, Twitter, you can reach out there. LinkedIn's generally the best. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Ant Murphy. You'll find me there. Yeah, that's probably the best way to reach out. You can also join my newsletter and you can always reply to that. I get those emails too, and I'll always happily help anyone who needs it.
Perfect. I will hyperlink all of your socials. And thank you so much for doing this. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. No, thanks for having me.